This is the end. Well, technically it's the beginning. Not the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning, but instead the beginning of the beginning. It's the beginning of a video about endings. That was kind of confusing. Endings are kind of the whole point when you think about it. I mean, the only reason that a reader reads a particular piece of reading material is because they want to read the ending. I mean, yeah, the other parts of a book are enjoyable, but having an enjoyable beginning and an enjoyable middle just makes readers that much more anxious to read the ending. So, as you can probably imagine, it's very important to get your ending right. There's a lot that goes into making an ending satisfying, but that's not specifically what I want to talk about today. Today, I want to talk about how you structure an ending, the specific story beats that need to be hit for most types of endings. I've broken this into 4 different steps or parts. These are the most common elements of endings, although not every structure will have these exact parts, and different structures might call them by different names than what I'm calling them here. This is by no means the only way to structure an ending, but it's the only way I'm going to discuss today, because talking about all of the ways to structure an ending would make the video way too long. Anyway, the 4 parts of the structure I want to talk about today are the failure, the low point, the change, and the resolution. I don't know how that became 5. Let's start with failure. Boy, that sounds depressing. I talked last week about try-fail cycles and how they factor into the middle or the rising action of a story. When you structure an ending like this, you are starting the ending with a big try and a big fail. Essentially, the protagonist attempts something massive to resolve the conflict of the story and fails, usually with disastrous consequences and a removal of all hope that they will ever solve the conflict. The failure should obviously be bigger than any other failure up to this point in the story, and you should make sure the consequences of the failure are massive. You want to make sure that the failure is something that the character is actually trying to do. So the failure shouldn't be something that the villain is doing towards the end of the story. But just having the villain or antagonist do something to get to the low point without any active action by the protagonist is a problem. This is because the purpose of the failure usually is to show that the character needs to change in order to solve the main conflict, and that continuing on as they are will not allow them to do so. It also adds to the stakes and makes the ending more exciting. After the failure, we have the low point. Points 1 and 2 of this structure are the most depressing. Point 3 and 4 get a little bit more uplifting. After the failure, the hero resigns themselves to failure because they, fail. This is the low point, the point in the story where all hope is lost, where the heroes wallow in their self-doubt, where the villain prepares to declare victory. As you can probably guess, this is usually a huge downer, and that's its main purpose. The low point is meant to be a jarring, soul-crushing moment for the hero. Generally, the pace of the story slows down in this section, giving the hero time to reflect and observe the consequences of their failure. The reason that they have to come to such a low point is there needs to be sufficient incentive in order for them to change. One of the purposes of the slower interlude at the low point is to give the character time to consider how they need to change in order to resolve the plot. This leads to the next section, the change. Next up is the change. That was a completely redundant line. I don't know why I said that. I mentioned before that the reason the character failed was they didn't have what it took to solve the main plot. The change is where they realize this and change. The change can take a million different forms and will of course vary from story to story, but generally it's either an internal change or an external one. If the character just needs to come to a realization, like getting over their own self-doubt or realizing that they need to rely on friends or some other revelation, then it's an internal change. If a chat with a mentor or the return of a friend does the trick, then the change is an external change. You have to be careful if the change that gets the character from the low point to the resolution is an external one. A new character or some piece of technology or a magical new weapon appearing at the last moment during the low point that gives the character the strength they need to defeat the villain is usually a recipe for an unsatisfying ending. Most of the time, if the change is going to be external, it needs to be well foreshadowed. In a story with a character arc where the character has an internal flaw that they need to overcome, the change is the point where they realize that internal flaw and change to overcome it. Their character arc doesn't have to end at that point. It can spill over into the resolution and into the following action, but usually there's some steps at least made towards fixing their flaw. In more plot-driven narratives where your protagonist is a more static character, the change is either external or usually takes the form of them seeing a piece of information in a new light or coming to some kind of realization about a way to solve the plot that doesn't necessarily result in them changing as a character. The important thing is that the changes things enough that it gives the main character what they need in order to resolve the main conflict of the story and lead into the last part of the ending, the resolution. Next up is the resolution. That line was also kind of redundant. Having failed during the failure, suffered during the low point, and changed during the change, the hero finally musters the courage and whatever else they need in order to resolve the conflict. The resolution is going to vary markedly from story to story. You have a bunch of different options as far as how this part is structured, although there are a few things to keep in mind. The way that the conflict ultimately gets resolved should have been impossible before the change. Otherwise, the change will seem meaningless. I mentioned this before, but avoid having some unforeshadowed force swoop in at the last moment and resolve everything. The resolution is not the time to introduce new characters or new powers unless those things have been hinted at earlier. And even in that case, I would be very, very careful. Also, and this goes without saying, your resolution actually needs to resolve the conflict. You can have endings where this doesn't happen, but those are much harder to pull off. You want to make sure that the main conflict is actually stopped by active action from the protagonist and that it doesn't just fizzle away or crush itself under its own weight or something like that. After the resolution comes what's known as the denouement or the falling action, which I'm not going to talk about today because this video is already getting really long. The falling action is where all the lingering story threads get resolved, all the character arcs come to a close, and we get that final sense of conclusion and finality. We'll talk about that next week. Until then, you'll just have to settle for this conclusion to give you a sense of conclusion and finality. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.